The afternoon sun bathed the small dirt path in golden hues, casting long shadows through the trees. The air was still, save for the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. David, a 34-year-old tourist, walked leisurely, inhaling the crisp forest air, hoping to escape the chaos of city life. He had arrived in Spain 3 days ago, seeking solitude, a reset, but what he would find today was something that would change him forever. As he took another step, a sudden rustling in the underbrush to his left made him freeze. His heart pounded. A wild animal. He wasn't used to encounters like these. His breath caught as he turned his head. And then he saw her. A German shepherd stood in the middle of the dirt road, her body stiff, her ribs faintly visible beneath her matted coat. Her once proud fur was dull, tangled with dust and dried mud. But it wasn't her appearance that made David's stomach tighten. It was her eyes. Deep brown. Desperate. Pleading. She didn't growl, didn't bark, didn't flinch. She just stared at him. David took a hesitant step forward, expecting her to bolt into the trees. She didn't move. And then, something happened that sent chills down his spine. The dog took a slow, shaky step toward him, then another. Her frail body trembled with each movement, as though she had been running for hours. When she was close enough, she did something that David had never seen a stray do before. She gently bit the edge of his pant leg and pulled. David stiffened. A sharp shiver ran down his spine. "What?" He barely whispered the word, too stunned to process. The dog released him for a second and looked up, her eyes filled with urgency. And then she pulled again. Harder. David's pulse quickened. Was she hungry? Was she desperate for food? That was his first thought. But something didn't fit. This wasn't just hunger, this was something else. She was asking for help. David crouched down slowly, trying not to startle her. "You want me to go with you?" The dog stiffened, tail low, body tense, but she didn't back away. And then, without warning, she turned and ran. Not the playful sprint of a dog leading an owner home. Not the carefree trot of a stray chasing after a scent. She ran like every second mattered, like time itself was running out. David's gut twisted. His instincts screamed at him. Go. Without hesitation, he ran after her. His sneakers kicked up dust as he followed, the winding dirt path growing narrower with every step. The forest thickened around them, the sun dipping lower, casting eerie streaks of light through the trees. But David wasn't thinking about the scenery. He was thinking about her. The way her frail legs kept pushing forward, even when they looked ready to collapse. The desperation in her eyes. The feeling in his chest that told him he was about to find something that would change everything. His breath came in sharp gasps as he kept pace, dodging low-hanging branches. The air grew cooler, damp. The forest floor became uneven, mud replacing the dry path beneath his feet. And then the smell hit him. A strange, thick scent hung in the air. Decay, confinement, something unnatural. David's heart pounded against his ribs. Where was she taking him? Just when he thought he might lose sight of her, the dog skidded to a sudden stop. David barely managed to slow himself in time. His lungs burned as he doubled over, trying to catch his breath. The German shepherd stood frozen in front of something, a small, run-down wooden cabin. Half hidden by the trees, the cabin looked like it had been forgotten by time. Its roof sagged under the weight of neglect, the windows were coated in grime, and the wooden door was covered in deep scratch marks that looked fresh. David swallowed hard, a knot forming in his throat. The dog turned to look at him, and then she let out a sound that shattered the silence, a deep, sorrowful, heart-wrenching cry. Not a bark, not a growl. A cry so filled with anguish that David's stomach twisted painfully. She approached the door, paused trembling, and scratched at it weakly, over and over, as if she had done this 1,000 times before, but never had the strength to break through. David felt a lump rise in his throat. What is inside? He knew before even opening the door, that whatever it was, it would stay with him forever. The dog turned her head toward him, eyes locked on his, begging, pleading. David didn't hesitate. He reached for the door. It was ajar. He pushed it open. The wood creaked. The scent of dampness and despair rushed out. And then he saw them. Small, fragile figures huddled in the darkness. His breath caught in his throat. Puppies. 4 of them. Weak. Dirty. Barely moving. David felt something inside him break. He stepped inside cautiously, his hands trembling. One of the puppies wasn't moving at all. And then his eyes caught something else in the dim light. A metal cage. Empty now, but lined with stains of dried blood. David's stomach turned violently. His mind raced. Who did this? Why? How long had they been here? David's gaze flickered back to the German shepherd. She stood at the doorway, body shaking, her head lowered, waiting, hoping, praying. David took a slow, shuddering breath. He wasn't leaving without them. The mother let out a soft whimper, stepping forward carefully. She nudged the smallest puppy, the one that hadn't moved. David's throat clenched. He knew what she was trying to do. She was saying goodbye. David swallowed hard, feeling his own eyes burn. "No," he whispered. "No more goodbyes." His fingers trembled as he reached down, carefully scooping up the 3 living puppies. They were so small, so fragile, so impossibly light in his arms. The German shepherd let out a sharp, panicked sound when she saw him pick them up, not out of fear, but out of desperation. David met her eyes. "I'm getting them out of here." The dog hesitated. Then she stepped beside him. She wasn't leaving them behind either. David adjusted his grip on the puppies and turned toward the door. His mind was racing. What kind of place was this? Why were there cages? Why was one of them empty? David shook the thoughts away. There was no time. The only thing that mattered now was getting them out alive. As he stepped out of the cabin, puppies in his arms, the German shepherd followed without a second thought. Her body was frail. Her steps were shaky. But her eyes held something new. Hope. David's heart pounded as he hurried down the overgrown path, cradling the fragile puppies in his arms. Their tiny bodies barely weighed anything, yet each step felt heavier than the last. The German shepherd mother ran beside him, panting, her ribs visible beneath her thin fur. But she didn't slow down, not for a second. She knew time was against them. The forest around them was eerily quiet, the towering trees swaying gently in the late afternoon breeze. But David's focus was solely on the creatures in his arms. They were so small, so weak. Their shallow breaths made his stomach clench with fear. He could feel their delicate ribs rising and falling against his palms, their bodies burning with fever. They were alive, but barely. He pushed forward, his sneakers sliding over loose dirt and roots. His muscles ached, but he refused to stop. He had no idea how long they had been trapped in that cabin, how long they had gone without food, without warmth, without their mother being able to do anything but watch them slowly fade away. David stole a glance at the German shepherd running beside him. Her eyes were locked on the puppies, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had been through so much, alone, abandoned, desperate. And yet she had never given up. That realization hit David like a punch to the gut. She had done everything she could. She had fought. She had waited. She had searched. And now she had found someone willing to fight alongside her. David clenched his jaw, his determination solidifying. He wasn't going to let them die. The path widened as they neared the edge of the forest. In the distance, the first houses of the town came into view. The sight sent a wave of relief through David's chest. They were close. His steps quickened. The cobblestone streets beneath his feet felt like salvation. Every breath burned in his lungs, but he didn't care. He could see the town square ahead, the place where he had first arrived 3 days ago, looking for nothing more than peace. Now, he was running for something far greater. People turned their heads as he passed. Some stopped in confusion, others murmured in concern. A woman near a cafe placed a hand over her mouth. "Dios mío," she whispered, watching the mother dog trailing behind him. But David didn't stop, didn't explain. He had one destination in mind: the veterinary clinic. The sign came into view, a small, weathered wooden board hanging above a white-painted door. David barely slowed as he shoved the door open with his shoulder, his breath ragged. "I need help," he shouted, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. The clinic was quiet for a split second before a woman in her 50s with graying hair tied in a bun rushed forward. Her sharp brown eyes widened the moment she saw the scene before her. She didn't hesitate. "Put them here," she commanded, pulling a soft blanket onto the examination table. David carefully lowered the puppies onto the fabric, his hands trembling. The German shepherd mother jumped up, placing her front paws on the table, whimpering in distress. David turned to the vet. "I found them," he said breathlessly. "They were locked in a cabin, abandoned." The vet's expression darkened. She crouched over the puppies, pressing her fingers gently against their frail bodies. "They're severely dehydrated," she muttered, reaching for her stethoscope. Her lips tightened. "Malnourished. Weak heartbeats. I don't know if they'll all make it." David's stomach twisted. Number. That wasn't an option. He swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me what I need to do." The vet met his eyes, and something in his face must have convinced her that he wasn't leaving, that he wasn't going to give up. She exhaled deeply, nodding. "All right," she said. "We fight." She worked quickly, inserting tiny IV lines into the puppy's frail legs, attaching them to warmers to raise their dangerously low body temperatures. The mother German shepherd never looked away, her entire body trembling with fear. David placed a hand on her back, feeling the rapid rise and fall of her breathing. "They're strong," he whispered to her. "Just like you." The mother didn't react, not at first. But after a few seconds she pressed her head against his arm, a silent plea, a silent trust. David's chest tightened. He wasn't leaving them. Minutes passed, turning into hours. David never moved from his spot. The clinic was silent except for the rhythmic beeping of the monitors, the slow drip of fluids. Then, a tiny broken sound. A whimper. David's head snapped toward the table. One of the puppies, the smallest, the weakest, had barely stirred, but it was enough. David's breath hitched. He was still fighting. The mother let out a soft cry, licking the pup's head gently. David closed his eyes, a lump forming in his throat. The vet exhaled. He's holding on, but he's not out of danger. David swallowed hard, his fingers trembling as he ran them through his hair. What else can we do? The vet hesitated before meeting his gaze. They need round-the-clock care, she said carefully. And if they get strong enough, they'll need a home. David didn't even pause. I'll take them, he said firmly. The vet's brow lifted in surprise. Are you sure? It's a big responsibility. David didn't look away. He had never been more certain of anything in his life. I'm taking them home. The German Shepherd mother turned to look at him. And for the first time, David saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Not just fear, not just desperation. The night pressed down like a heavy weight, thick with silence. The only sounds inside the veterinary clinic were the rhythmic beeping of the monitors and the slow, steady drip of IV fluids. The fluorescent lights cast a pale glow over the examination table, illuminating the fragile bodies of the 3 puppies wrapped in soft thermal blankets. Their tiny chests rose and fell, each breath so faint that David had to lean in to make sure they were still alive. He had never felt this kind of helplessness before. David sat motionless, his elbows resting on his knees, his fingers clasped together so tightly they ached. His eyes never left the smallest of the puppies, the one who had barely moved since they arrived. He was impossibly small, even for a newborn, his fur damp from fever, his breathing ragged and uneven. Every few minutes, his little body would shudder, as if clinging to life with every ounce of strength he had left. The German Shepherd mother lay curled beside the table, her gaze locked onto her babies. She hadn't moved since the vet had placed them there. She didn't blink, didn't sleep. Her body trembled with exhaustion, but she refused to close her eyes. Every time one of the puppies whimpered, she flinched. Her ears twitched at every sound, waiting, hoping for something to change. David reached down, running his hand along her back. She was cold, too cold. They're fighters, he whispered, his voice hoarse, just like you. She didn't react, but after a long, painful silence, she pressed her head against his arm. A silent agreement, a silent trust. Hours passed in agonizing slow motion. The vet worked tirelessly, checking vitals, adjusting IVs, ensuring the puppies were warm enough to survive the night. But there were no promises. Every passing hour felt like a countdown, every small movement an impossible battle. David had never been a religious man, but sitting there in the dimly lit clinic he prayed, not to any god, not to fate, but to them. He willed them to hold on, to fight. Then, just past dawn, it happened. A tiny movement. A fragile, weak stretch of a paw against the blanket. David's breath hitched. He bolted upright, his heart slamming against his ribs. The smallest puppy, the one they had feared wouldn't last the night, let out a soft, raspy cry. The mother German Shepherd whimpered, standing up so quickly that her legs nearly buckled. She nudged her baby desperately, licking his tiny head as if to say, "You did it. You made it through the night." David exhaled sharply, pressing a trembling hand over his mouth. The vet rushed forward, scanning the puppy's vitals. "He's still critical," she murmured, her voice carefully controlled. "But he's alive." David let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His fingers trembled as he reached out, gently brushing his knuckles over the puppy's fur. "You're a little warrior," he whispered. The mother dog let out a soft, quivering cry. A sound so raw, so full of relief, that it made David's throat tighten. But it wasn't over yet. The other two puppies were still weak, their bodies struggling to regulate warmth despite the heated blankets. The smallest one had survived the night, but he wasn't safe. Not yet. David felt an ache settle deep in his chest. He had never felt responsible for anything this way before. Never known what it was like to have something so fragile depend on him. But as he sat there, watching this tiny family fight for every breath, he knew this wasn't just about them anymore. They weren't alone. And neither was he. The vet sighed, rubbing her temples. "We'll keep monitoring them, but—" She hesitated, looking at David carefully. "If they pull through, they'll need round-the-clock care, and when they're strong enough—" She trailed off. David already knew what she was about to say. "They'll need a home," he finished for her. The vet nodded. David didn't even pause. "I'll take them." The vet's brow lifted in surprise. "Are you sure? This is a big responsibility." David looked down at the German Shepherd mother. She was watching him now, her deep brown eyes searching his face. There was no fear in them this time, no hesitation, just trust. "I'm taking them home," he said again, his voice steady. And for the first time since he met her, he saw something new in her eyes. Not just desperation, not just pain, but hope. The morning air was crisp as David stepped out of the veterinary clinic, cradling the small box in his arms. Inside, nestled in warm blankets, the three puppies stirred weakly, their tiny bodies still fragile but alive. Each breath they took felt like a victory, a promise that the fight wasn't over, but they were no longer fighting alone. Beside him, the German Shepherd mother hesitated at the threshold of the clinic, her paws rooted to the ground. Her dark eyes flickered between David, the box in his arms, and the open world beyond the door. For so long, the outside world had only meant danger, hunger, betrayal. But today, for the first time in what felt like forever, it meant something else. It meant freedom. David crouched down beside her, his voice low, steady. "Come on, girl, let's go home." She lingered for a heartbeat longer. Then, taking a slow, deliberate step forward, she crossed the threshold. David smiled. The car ride back was silent, save for the occasional rustling of the blankets as the puppies shifted. David kept glancing at them, his heart pounding with every small movement they made. The German Shepherd sat in the passenger seat, her body still tense, ears flicking at every noise outside. She hadn't taken her eyes off her baby since they left the clinic. She didn't trust this new reality yet. David understood. He pulled into the driveway of his small cabin and cut the engine. The house sat quietly against the backdrop of towering trees, its wooden porch bathed in the soft light of morning. It wasn't much, not compared to the world beyond these trees, but for the first time, it felt like home. David opened the door and stepped out, carefully lifting the box from the seat. He felt the German Shepherd's hesitation before he even turned around. She wasn't moving. She sat stiffly in the car, staring at the open door of the house as if it were a cage waiting to close behind her. David's chest tightened. Houses had never been safe for her. Doors had only ever meant confinement. People had only ever meant pain. But this time, it was different. David crouched beside her, keeping his voice soft. "It's okay, you're safe now." She met his gaze, her deep brown eyes searching his face. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she moved. One cautious step, then another. And just like that, she followed him inside. David set the box down gently on the floor, pulling back the blankets to reveal the sleeping puppies. The German Shepherd immediately moved to them, her body curling protectively around their small forms. David exhaled, running a hand through his hair. For the first time in what felt like forever, they could rest. But some wounds didn't heal overnight. The days passed in a careful routine. The puppies began eating in small, cautious bites, their tiny bodies growing stronger with each passing hour. Their mother never left their side, licking their fur, keeping them warm, watching their every breath. David barely slept, waking up at every small whimper, at every restless shift. And the German Shepherd, she watched him too, not with fear anymore, but with caution. She followed his movements through the house, eyes tracing his every step. When he refilled the food bowls, she waited. When he adjusted the blankets for the puppies, she watched. When he sat on the couch at the end of the night, exhausted but content, she remained curled in the corner of the room, observing. She didn't fully trust this new life yet. David didn't blame her. Then, one night, he woke to a sound, a soft, whimpering cry. David rubbed his eyes, disoriented. The room was dark, save for the dim glow of the moon filtering through the curtains. Then, he saw her. The German Shepherd was sitting near the window, her body rigid, ears pressed flat against her skull. Her eyes were locked on something outside. David's pulse quickened. She was waiting for something, or worse, someone. He moved slowly, careful not to startle her. "Hey," he murmured, crouching beside her. "What is it?" She flinched but didn't look away from the window. David followed her gaze, but saw nothing. Just the trees swaying in the wind, the empty dirt road leading to the cabin. But something about the way she stared, so still, so tense, made the hairs on the back of David's neck rise. He reached out hesitantly, sliding a hand along her back. She was shaking. David frowned. Whoever had done this to her, whoever had abandoned her, locked her away, left her to die, was still in her mind, still haunting her. David clenched his jaw. "No one's coming for you," he whispered. "Not anymore." The German Shepherd's body trembled beneath his touch, but then, slowly, she turned to look at him. Her dark eyes softened, just slightly. She leaned into his touch, and for the first time since they met she let out a deep, tired sigh. As if, for the first time in a long time, she finally believed it. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden light over the small yard. The puppies tumbled through the grass, their tiny tails wagging as they chased each other in clumsy circles. Their mother lay nearby, her dark eyes following their every move. David leaned against the porch railing, arms crossed, a quiet smile tugging at his lips. It had been weeks since he found them. Weeks of sleepless nights, cautious steps, slow healing. But now they were safe. They were home. Or so he thought. Then came the sound that changed everything. An engine. A low, rumbling growl that sent a ripple of unease through the peaceful afternoon. David turned, his stomach twisting. A black car rolled to a slow stop just outside the fence. 2 men stepped out. David's blood ran cold, and then he saw her. The German Shepherd's body went rigid, her ears flattened, her muscles coiled like a spring wound too tight. She didn't bark, didn't growl, she froze. David didn't need to ask. The fear in her eyes, the way her tail curled beneath her body, the way her paws dug into the earth as if she wanted to disappear, told him everything. She knew them. David swallowed hard, his fingers curling into fists. The taller man adjusted his jacket, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Nice place you got here," he drawled. The other man, shorter, wiry, tilted his head toward the dog. "You have something that belongs to us." David's jaw tightened. "There's nothing here for you." The taller man sighed, shaking his head. "Look, buddy, we don't want trouble. Just give us the dog and we'll be on our way." David's fists clenched. "She's not yours." The shorter man scoffed. "Or, she's just a mutt. You really want to pick a fight over a stray?" David's vision blurred with rage. She wasn't just a mutt. She was a survivor, a mother, a fighter, and she wasn't going anywhere. Beside him, the German shepherd trembled, but something in her eyes shifted. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was something stronger. She took a slow step forward, then another. David could feel her hesitation, the war raging inside her. Run or fight, hide or stand. And then she chose. She stood tall. Her ears pricked forward, her tail lifted. And then she barked, loud, sharp, defiant. David had never heard a sound like it before. It wasn't a bark of fear, it was a warning, a promise. The taller man faltered. For the first time, they saw her. Not as a weak, discarded creature. Not as something broken, but as something untouchable. David stepped forward, his voice low and steady. "She's not coming with you." The shorter man muttered a curse under his breath. "Gee, whatever. Not worth it." The taller man exhaled sharply, glancing at the dog one last time. "She's your problem now." They turned, got back in their car. The engine roared to life. David watched as they drove away, disappearing down the dirt road. Gone, forever. He let out a slow breath, his muscles still coiled, his heart still racing. Then he looked at her. She was still staring at the road, her body tense, her ears twitching. Then she turned to him and wagged her tail, just once, just enough. David felt something inside him break. A slow warmth spread through his chest, something deep, something powerful. She wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't running anymore. She was home. David crouched down, placing a hand on her head. "It's over," he whispered. "You're safe now." She pressed her head against his palm. And David knew he wasn't just saving her. She had saved him too. This story is a reminder that dogs never abandon us, but too many times humans abandon them. Luna fought for her family for a home, for the love she always deserved. But not all dogs get a second chance. If this story touched your heart, help us share it with the world. Like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories. And if you believe every dog deserves a home, share this video with someone who needs to remember that love and compassion can change lives. Because in the end, it's not them who need us, it's us who need them.